have to imagine, I take you to a world that's about 150 years older than this one. It completely resembles our world, so geographically there is a New Zealand behind the mirror, but it's quite different. All your fairy tales and every story is historical truth. So I guess if you walked out of the theatre, probably the theatre would not exist yet. Auckland would be a very young city, and there would be coaches, I would say, lots of horses. And you know much better than I do what kind of creatures would be out there. Because every fairy tale creature, every hero ever made up in this country would be alive and living out there. I'm not sure you would be a colony. Probably you wouldn't. Because what I like to do behind the mirror is to give some countries already independence when they don't have it yet in our world. The characters you will meet are first of all Jake Breakfast, who's my hero, born in New York, 24 years old, and one of the most famous treasure hunters behind the mirror. He became famous by finding the glass slipper of Cinderella and selling it for a fortune to the Queen of Austria. He is at the moment in a bit of trouble because a fairy cast a spell on him, a quite deadly spell, and he's looking for a cure. So he heard about a crossbow owned by a king who was called the Witch Slayer. And that crossbow has a very strange ability. If you shoot one arrow at the general of an army, you will kill the whole army with it. If you shoot the same arrow at someone you love, you may save his or her life. So Jacob thinks, well, why not try? I'm dying anyway. Why not find this crossbow and have my best friend shoot that arrow at me? And his best friend is Fox. She's both a woman and a fox. So she's a shapeshifter. And you will meet her as well. There's a third person with them, and I will take you in a minute to the Switzerland mountains. It's called Helvetia, behind the mirror, into a tomb of the king who owned that crossbow. The third person is a dwarf, and his name is Valiant, Evan Valiant, to be precise, and he is quite greedy, and he's only there for the treasure. For the ones of you who don't like to be in tombs, I apologize in advance. The sand wafting towards them through the crypt door was barely noticeable. Tomb clothes were a simple method to protect the dead from the greed of the living. Their poisonous pollen could survive over centuries. Jacob held Valiant back. Fox took a pouch from her belt. The seeds she offered were barely bigger than the pips of an apple. Eat, she told the dwarf, who eyed her suspiciously, unless you want to look like a moldy loaf of bread after a few steps. And watch your step, Jacob whispered. Don't touch anything. Keep your mouth shut, especially if something asks you to question. Question something. Valiant popped the seeds into his mouth. His wide eyes stared into the dark tunnel in front of them. The walls were lined with burial niches. Fox grabbed the dwarf just before he stumbled into one of the mummified corpses. Why do you think they were buried here? She hissed at him when Jacob pushed the mummy back into its niche. This is the tomb of a warlock. I'm sure they're easily woken. The man they found a few steps in had been dead only a few days. The tomb clothes had covered him with a carpet of deadly green blossoms. The whispers began as soon as Fox stepped over his corpse. Why? The voices came from the burial niches. Valiant froze, but Jacob pushed him along. Don't answer, he breathed. They're harmless, as long as you don't reply. The mummies wore weapons belts and armored breastplates over their rotting clothes. Most of Gismund's knights had followed him to his death, though if historic records were to be believed, only few of them had done so voluntarily. They found 5 more fresh corpses, the treasure hunters who hadn't returned. In addition to being covered in tomb gloves, some of them had also showed sword wounds, and the dead were spread all around them. Jacob had never seen so much fear on the dwarf's cunning face. He was usually not affected. In his experience, the places of the living were much more dangerous Yet as he walked past the burial niches, he could feel the spell like a cold hand on his chest. Look at them, Jacob. Soon you look like them. The leather-like skin, the teeth exposed, and spiders nesting where your eyes used to be. His breathing grew labored, and Fox noticed. She silently pushed her past him and walked ahead, as though that could draw death's attention from him. The tunnel took a bend, and there was another dog, inlaid with the golden likeness of a man. The crown identified him as a king, and the cat-fur coat showed him to be a warlock. On his shoulder sat a gold raven, the symbol of limitless wealth, and his feet stood in 7-league boots to symbolize the vastness of his empire. He was holding the crossbow in his right hand. Supposedly, the witch slayer had sold his soul to the devil to get it. Stories. However, Jacob had already seen too many of them prove true on this side of the mirror to dismiss this one. The door with Gismund's portrait stood open a crack. The treasure hunter whose corpse they found just inside had probably thought himself at the goal of his quest, and he had obviously forgotten that traps were usually left invitingly open. His body was uninjured, as far as Jacob could make out, but the horror on the pallid face spoke clearly. Fox peered over his shoulder. "The shadow spell," she whispered. "Yes, probably." Jacob put his lamp on the floor and drew his knife. The resin he rubbed on the blade brought the smell of tree bark into the stale air. Behind him, Fox was shifting shape. Sometimes the vixen's senses were far more useful than an additional pistol. There it was again. The familiar thrill mixed with fear and the desire to conquer it. Irresistible. He'd never had to explain that to Fox. She slipped through the door ahead of him. The tomb was enormous. The frescoes on the walls still glowed in vibrant color thanks to the centuries of darkness that had cocooned them since their creation. They were depictions of hell, rendered so masterfully they made one feel the fire on the skin. One of the walls showed Gismund himself riding through the flames in the arm of a knight. The devil he was riding towards didn't have much in common with the devil Jacob knew from the other side of the mirror. Except for the horns, he looked like an ordinary human, dressed in the clothes of a wealthy merchant. The frescoes on the ceiling showed a battlefield, the spirits of the dead departing from their lifeless bodies. The columns that supported the ceiling were hewn from the same black marble as the sarcophagus standing in the center of the tomb. 4 knights knelt around it, each leaning on a sword as black as its wings. Jacob had Valiant behind him, muttering a disappointed curse. The sarcophagus was open. They were too late. The pieces of the smashed lid were scattered among the kneeling knights. Between them lay the guard against whom Jacob had prepared his knife, Gismund's shadow, faceless, and as tall as though it had been cast onto the flagstones by the evening sun. The pool of blood around it indicated that the shadow had been brought to life by a spell only witches could perform. A shadow like that would kill for his master as silently as he had followed him through life. Jacob leaned over the black corpse. A knife stuck out of the shadow's neck. It smelled of resin. The mistake of pulling it out would immediately bring the shadow back to life. Whoever had killed him knew that. Jacob stood up. For an instant, he thought he could hear steps between the columns. But when he spun around, he saw only Fox standing behind him. Is he still here? She lifted her nose to sniff and shook her head. Damn! Jacob tucked his knife back into his belt. Not many treasure hunters knew how to get past a giantling or what resin to use to defeat a dead man's shadow. They usually avoided each other on the hunt, but Jacob knew them all, at least by name and reputation. Which one had done this? Damn bastard! Valiant was standing on the debris of the lid, staring down into the open sarcophagus. He even took the crown, he clamored. And who told him to cut off the heart? Are those greybeards in the council now trading with dark witches? The corpse in the sarcophagus had not decayed at all, but it was missing the right hand and the head, and there was a hole in the chest where the heart had once beat. The wound, like the ones on the arm and neck, had been sealed with gold. This meant that the body had been buried like this. Jacob looked around. The tomb's floor was laid with green marble, and strips of alabaster ran like the dial of a compass from each of the 4 columns to the sarcophagus. Jacob picked up the mine lamp Valiant had put down next to the sarcophagus and walked along one of those alabaster strips. It was inlaid with letters cast in white gold. They were barely visible in the white stone. Yupitsphoebe. Every treasure hunter knew that language. Fox watched Jacob as he paced off the second and third strip. Handu Sundarab. Herze Osterab. The inscriptions were easy to translate. The head in the west, the hand in the south, the heart in the east. Maybe the hunt wasn't over yet. Jacob went to the 4th strip. Its inscription was much longer than the others. Niemand zusammen, besitzbar was Tero, einer begehört. Verborgen was die Elio begangen. What you got those gloves for? Take that scepter off him, Valiant claimant. And he's still got the signet ring on the other hand. Jacob ignored the dwarf. He was staring at the letters. Only together may they possess what each desires. Concealed where they all began. No. The other one hadn't found the crossbow. Not yet. Jacob. Fox was still wearing a fur. The steps, barely audible. Jacob lifted the lantern. He thought he could make out a shape between the columns, dark like the stone it was trying to hide behind. Before he could stop her, Fox was dashing toward it. The vixen's compulsion to hunt made her careless. Jacob ran after her, cursing himself for not having given the tomb a thorough search. He heard Fox yelp and nearly stumbled over her. She was lying between the columns, already shifting shape as she struggled to her feet. That instant, the dwarf cried out for help behind them. The man who shoved Valiant out of his way was wearing the clothes of skin of his own, which was as black as onyx. A goyle. Just as Jacob took aim, Valiant staggered into his line of sight. The goyle gave him a little taunting wave before pulling the tomb's door shut behind him. Valiant screamed, stumbling towards the door. He clawed his fingers into the frieze of skulls and yanked at the door so hard that the bones cracked under his hands. "Why didn't you shoot him?" he yelled. "Perishing inside the tomb! Is that your idea of a good death?" Fox's forehead was bleeding. Jacob brushed away her hair, but luckily the gash wasn't deep. "Why didn't you smell him?" He didn't have a scent. She was angry. Angry with herself and with the stranger who had gotten the better of her. No scent. Jacob looked towards the shadow and the resin-covered knife. The goyle knew his trade. "We're going to starve." Valiant looked around like a rat trapped, caught in a trap. Jacob went back to the alabaster strips and looked at the letters. Suffocation is more likely. Fox came to his side. "I'll find his trail," she whispered. "I promise." But Jacob shook his head. Forget about the goyle. Doesn't have the crossbow. He was still looking at the letters. The words were a trail they'd have to follow. "What the devil are you two doing there?" Valiant's voice filled the tomb with dwarf panic. "Do something! This can't be the first tomb you've got dropped in!" He was right. Jacob returned to the sarcophagus and with his gloved hand reached for the scepter. The architects of royal tombs often believed that their master was only sleeping and that he would wake up again one day, so they always left him with a key, even though it seemed even more likely than usual that a headless king would awaken as needed. The door swung open as soon as Jacob wrote Gismund's name in the air with the scepter. Valiant immediately stumbled through the door, but Jacob carefully stepped over the dead treasure hunter and listened. He thought he could hear steps in the distance. "How did the goyle know about the tomb?" the dwarf asked. "They call him a bastard," Jacob said. he's the only Goyle who's any good at treasure hunting. The bastard, of course. Benny dropped his face, the cold sweat of fear still clung to his forehead. He likes to cut off his competitors' fingers. Fingers, hands, noses. He's got quite a reputation. Jacob wrapped the scepter into the dead hunter's jacket. He stepped to the tomb's door and inspected Giesman's golden portrait. He could only hope the Goyle would beat him at solving the witch slayer's riddle. As if having to race against death wasn't enough.